This slide set is about the provisioning of web pages to users by the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. There are three methods called non-persistent HTTP, multiple simultaneous connections, and persistent HTTP. As we will see on the following slides, there are differences related to the performance of the methods. However, it is a question whether to select a method just based on this criterion. The original method, which is called non-persistent HTTP, works as follows. A client who wants to retrieve a web page starts a TCP connection, since HTTP is based on TCP. After the three-way handshake, it requests the web page whose structure is delivered by the server afterwards. The server then terminates the TCP connection. The client parses the HTML code and may find references to objects contained in the web page. The typical example for such an object is a picture, but other objects such as embedded audio or video players are also possible. The client then opens another TCP connection to request the first object. The server provides the object and closes the TCP connection. For the second object, another TCP connection is opened and closed in the following. In summary, a series of TCP connections is used to retrieve the web page including all objects. The performance of this method is not so good. One issue is that TCP connections are opened and closed all the time. Therefore, you always have the 3 segments for the connection setup and 4 segments to close the connection. Another point is that the connections often only exist for a relatively short period of time. If you consider how TCP's connection control works, then you see that the data rates do not reach a high level. The slow start begins, but after a few segments the connection is already terminated, so that the average data rate is relatively low. This method was quite useful in the beginning of the World Wide Web, when web pages contained a lot of text and few images. However, with the introduction of more and more multimedia elements, there was a need to change it. The method multiple simultaneous connections has been introduced by Netscape, the leading browser vendor in the 1990s. The beginning of it is not different from the previous method, but once the objects have been identified, several TCP connections are started directly after each other to retrieve a certain number of objects in parallel. The method uses the same number of TCP connections and has the same performance issues inside of each TCP connection, but due to the parallel TCP connections, some unnecessary waiting times are avoided. The next method is called persistent HTTP. Its idea is not to open and close TCP connections all the time, but to do all requests for objects within one TCP connection. Therefore, there is only one TCP connection, so that the overhead for repeated 3-way handshakes and 4-way closes is avoided. In addition, the data rate for the TCP connection is relatively high because it is kept up for a longer period of time. At the end, the client has to initiate the connection close because the server does not know how many further requests are going to be done by the client. A further improvement is called request pipelining. It tries to improve the performance of persistent HTTP by posing requests for objects in parallel within the one TCP connection. We have seen that each new method has improved the performance. However, persistent HTTP relies on the client to properly terminate the TCP connection. if you have malicious clients that do not terminate the TCP connections on purpose, then the server can get overloaded. It may have to administrate so many existing TCP connections so that it cannot answer to further clients. A low timeout value may help to terminate TCP connections relatively quickly, but the issue basically remains. Furthermore, request pipelining may not be as beneficial as expected if requests are handled in a sequential manner on the server side. In summary, you therefore often find servers that use the multiple simultaneous connections method.